Picture a cold winter night in 1580. A knock echoes through the grand halls of a nobleman's estate in Seville. Before the door can open, armed men burst inside, dragging one of Spain's most respected scholars from his home under the cover of darkness. His crime, suspicion of heresy, but behind the official charges, whispers swirl about his growing influence and the powerful figures who felt threatened by his ideas. This wasn't just about religion, it was about control. For centuries, the Spanish Inquisition has been remembered as a brutal campaign of religious purges, but what if that's only half the story? What if the truth is far more calculated, a web of political maneuvers and hidden power struggles disguised as faith? The Spanish Inquisition wasn't just a tool for rooting out heresy, it was a weapon wielded by kings, nobles, and even rival factions within the church itself. Behind the grand speeches about purity and salvation lay a shadowy world of secret alliances, silenced rivals, and wealth seized under the guise of divine justice. Monasteries overflowing with confiscated gold, families stripped of their land, and thinkers erased from history, all in the name of God, but who really profited. And why did the Inquisition target certain people while turning a blind eye to others? That's what we're uncovering today. This is the story of the Spanish Inquisition's hidden agendas, the untold schemes that reshaped empires, buried dissent, and left a trail of secrets we're still piecing together centuries later. From coded letters between powerful bishops to the shocking fate of those who dared to question the system, we're diving deep into the shadows of history. Because sometimes the most terrifying stories aren't the ones written in blood, but the ones written between the lines. To understand why the Spanish Inquisition became such a fearsome force, we have to rewind to a time of chaos and shifting power. The year 1478 wasn't just about religion, it was about survival. Spain was fractured, fresh from centuries of war during the Reconquista, where Christian kingdoms fought to reclaim the Iberian Peninsula from Muslim rule. But victory didn't bring peace. The newly unified Spain under Ferdinand and Isabella was a tinderbox of tensions, with Jewish and Muslim communities, many of whom had lived there for generations, now viewed with suspicion by the Christian elite. Enter Pope Sixtus IV. Under pressure from the Spanish monarchs, he issued a papal bull that year, granting them the authority to root out heresy. On paper, it was about protecting the faith, but behind closed doors, it was a masterstroke of political control. Ferdinand and Isabella knew uncertainty bred weakness, and the Inquisition gave them a weapon to silence dissent, confiscate wealth, and force unity under their crown. Take the case of Tomás de Torquemada, the infamous first Grand Inquisitor. A man of ruthless ambition, he didn't just target religious minorities, he went after wealthy Conversos, Jewish converts to Christianity accused of secretly practicing their old faith. Their trials were rarely about doctrine. Instead, they were about land, gold, and breaking the influence of families who threatened the monarchy's grip. And the timing was no accident. With the Reconquista barely over, old grudges still smoldered. The Inquisition became a way to redirect public fear away from the crown's failures and onto convenient scapegoats. It wasn't just faith being purified, it was power being consolidated, one terrified whisper at a time. But why focus so intensely on these Conversos families who had already converted to Christianity? The answer lies in a dangerous mix of greed, suspicion, and a radical new idea taking hold in Spain. That faith wasn't just about belief, it was in your blood. Enter limpieza de sangre, the infamous purity of blood statutes. These laws didn't just discriminate against Jews and Muslims, they targeted their descendants, no matter how devoutly Christian they'd become. Even generations later, a single Jewish ancestor could taint a family's reputation, barring them from universities, government positions, or noble titles. And here's where things turned sinister. The Inquisition didn't just enforce these laws, it weaponized them. take Maria Gonzalez, a wealthy merchant's daughter in Toledo. Her family had been baptized Catholics for 3 generations, but when a rival accused them of lighting Sabbath candles in secret, the Inquisition pounced. Their true crime, owning prime farmland that a local bishop coveted. Under torture, Maria's father confessed, and the family's property was swiftly divided between the church and the crown. This wasn't an exception, it was the system working as designed. The irony, many conversos were more devout than their accusers. Some had ancestors who converted centuries earlier during violent pogroms, yet they still faced accusations of crypto-Judaism. Why? Because heresy trials were incredibly profitable. Convictions meant confiscated estates, and the Inquisition kept detailed ledgers. One record from Cordoba shows over 40,000 ducats seized from a single family. But the paranoia went deeper than money. Spanish elites feared conversos held too much influence. Many were doctors, bankers, or scholars integral to society yet resented for their success. When King Ferdinand needed funds for his wars, guess who financed him? Converso bankers. And when those same bankers later faced trial, their loans conveniently vanished from royal account books. The darkest twist, the Inquisition created a self-sustaining cycle of fear. Neighbors denounced rivals to settle old grudges, knowing accusations alone could ruin lives. In Valencia, a single anonymous note accusing a man of avoiding pork led to his entire lineage being investigated for decades. No proof was needed, just whispers. And so the machine kept turning, fueled by gold and paranoia, leaving families to wonder. In a kingdom where faith was measured in bloodlines, could anyone ever truly be safe? Here's where the Inquisition's true machinery reveals itself, not in the dungeons or the auto da fe, but in the account books. Every accusation, every confession, every burned body had a financial paper trail. The crown and the church didn't just punish heresy, they monetized it. When a person was convicted, their property wasn't merely seized, it was liquidated down to the last spoon, with the proceeds split between the royal treasury and the inquisitors themselves. This wasn't justice, it was a racket. Take the case of the Mendoza family, one of the wealthiest dynasties in Castile. In 1492, just months after the infamous Alhambra decree expelled Jews from Spain, the patriarch Diego Mendoza was accused of secretly observing Jewish rituals. The evidence: a servant claimed he'd seen Diego refuse wine at a dinner party, a flimsy excuse but enough to trigger an investigation. Within weeks, the family's vast estates, their priceless library, and even their vineyards were auctioned off. The buyer, a cousin of the inquisitor presiding over the case. Coincidence? Hardly. The system was designed for plunder. In Valencia, records show that over 60% of confiscated property went directly to the crown, funding King Ferdinand's military campaigns in Italy. The rest lined the pockets of local inquisitors, who often received bonuses for high-profile convictions. One ledger from Toledo lists a single inquisitor's share as 12,000 gold ducats, 2 silver candlesticks, and a Moorish tapestry, all stripped from a single merchant convicted on hearsay. But the real scandal lay in the loopholes. Wealthy targets could sometimes negotiate their way out of execution by donating their assets upfront, a practice so common it had a name: composición. In 1530, a silk magnate named Alonso de Herrera avoided the stake by signing over his workshops to the church. He lived, but his family was reduced to beggary. Meanwhile, the archbishop who brokered the deal used the funds to build a private chapel. Even the dead weren't safe. The Inquisition dug up skeletons literally to posthumously convict heretics, allowing them to seize inheritances from descendants. In 1584, a widow in Seville watched as her husband's bones were exhumed and burned for alleged heresy, a verdict that conveniently nullified her claim to his olive groves, which were handed to a royal favorite. The message was clear: faith might save your soul, but only loyalty could save your fortune. and in a kingdom where accusation equaled guilt, the Inquisition didn't just enforce orthodoxy, it bankrolled an empire. The flames of heresy trials didn't just consume the vulnerable, they licked at the heels of Spain's most powerful. Behind the righteous rhetoric, the Inquisition had another master, the monarchy's relentless grip on power. When nobles or intellectuals dared to challenge royal authority, the machinery of faith could twist suddenly, turning doctrinal courts into political weapons. Few cases reveal this darker game more starkly than the downfall of the Count of Urgell. Once a towering figure in Catalonia, the Count wasn't just a landowner, he was a symbol of regional defiance. His family had ruled Urgell for generations, resisting centralized control from Castile. But in 1487, his luck ran out. Accused of harboring Jewish sympathizers, he found himself dragged before an inquisitorial tribunal. The charges suspiciously vague. Witnesses claimed he'd questioned the crown's heavy taxes in private conversations. Others whispered he'd mocked the Inquisition's methods over dinner. No matter, the tribunal declared him guilty of spreading doubt, a heresy adjacent to treason. His lands were confiscated, his title stripped, and his fate served as a blunt lesson: loyalty trumped lineage. This wasn't isolated. In Andalusia, the Duke of Medina Sidonia, a rival to Queen Isabella's favorites, faced sudden accusations of protecting Muslim converts. Never mind that his family had fought for Castile during the Reconquista. The tribunal's verdict stripped him of key fortresses, handing them to royal allies. And in Toledo, a university rector who'd penned essays on fair taxation vanished into Inquisition prisons, his writings burned as seditious. The pattern was transparent. Intellectuals who critiqued the crown's policies risked being branded as heretics. Local leaders who resisted Madrid's demands found their piety scrutinized. Even the dead weren't spared. Posthumous trials erased dissenting legacies, ensuring their heirs couldn't reclaim influence. What made these cases especially sinister was their theatricality. Trials of prominent figures were public spectacles staged to maximize terror. When the Count of Urgell was paraded through Barcelona in a heretic's yellow robe, the message wasn't just about sin, it was about the cost of defiance. Across Spain, nobles took note, regional autonomy crumbled, dissent withered. The Inquisition's genius lay in its ambiguity. By framing political purges as spiritual cleansings, the crown could dismantle opposition without sparking outright rebellion. After all, who would defend a heretic? And so, beneath the shadow of the cross, an empire of silence grew, one where fear kept even the mighty in line. The Spanish Inquisition didn't just answer to God, it answered to the crown, and that was by design. While other European inquisitions reported to local bishops or the Vatican, Spain's version cut out the middlemen, creating a direct pipeline from the dungeons to the royal court. This wasn't an oversight, it was a power play. When Ferdinand and Isabella secured papal approval for the Inquisition in 1478, they made sure its inquisitors swore allegiance not to the Pope, but to the monarchy. Local bishops, often tied to regional noble families, found themselves sidelined. Inquisitors could override their authority, summoning suspects, seizing property, and even excommunicating clergy without consulting them. Take the case of Archbishop Carrillo of Toledo, a powerful prelate who protested when the Inquisition began arresting his priests. The crown's response: they had him investigated for heresy. The message was clear: no one, not even a prince of the church, was above the monarch's new holy police. But the real shockwave hit Rome. The Vatican initially saw the Inquisition as a tool to unify Spain's fractured faith. They didn't anticipate how fiercely the Spanish monarchy would weaponize it against papal influence. By 1520, tensions erupted over the Patronato Real, a system where the crown, not the Pope, appointed bishops in Spain's colonies. When Pope Clement VII objected, King Charles V retaliated by expanding the Inquisition's reach, targeting clergy with ties to Rome. One notorious example, the trial of Bartolomé de Carranza, Archbishop of Toledo. a respected theologian and papal ally, Carranza was arrested in 1559 after the Inquisition cherry-picked sentences from his writings, twisting them into heresy. The real crime: he'd criticized royal interference in church affairs. For 17 years, he languished in prison despite multiple popes demanding his release until he finally confessed under duress. His case sent a chilling signal: Spain's church belonged to its kings, not to Rome. Even the Vatican's attempts to rein in the Inquisition backfired. When Pope Sixtus IV tried to assert control over trials in 1482, Ferdinand threatened to cut off Spain's financial support to the Holy See. The Pope backed down. By 1500, the Spanish Inquisition was practically a state ministry, with its own spies, prisons, and most crucially, a financial pipeline that bypassed Rome entirely. Tithes meant for the Vatican diverted to fund inquisitorial tribunals, confiscated lands from heretics, often gifted to royal loyalists, not the church. This shadow bureaucracy reached its peak under Philip II, who used the Inquisition to crush the Council of Trent's reforms. When Spanish bishops returned from Trent with plans to decentralize church authority, Philip had the Inquisition vet their sermons for Lutheran tendencies. The result: a clergy too terrified to challenge Madrid's grip. By the late 1600s, Spain's Inquisition had become something unprecedented. A hybrid of holy office and secret police, enforcing orthodoxy not for the soul's salvation but for the crown's supremacy. The irony was bitter. An institution born to purify faith had morphed into a tool of raw political control, proving that in the shadow of the cross, even the Pope's authority had its limits. The streets of 16th century Madrid fell silent as the procession began. First came the hooded priests, their chants rising like smoke into the air. Then the condemned, barefoot and clad in yellow San Benito robes painted with flames and demons walking advertisements of damnation. Last marched the soldiers, not to protect the crowd, but to ensure no one looked away. This was the auto da fe, the act of faith, but its true purpose had little to do with salvation. These spectacles were masterclasses in psychological terror, meticulously staged to turn fear into obedience. At first glance, the rituals seemed purely religious. Heretics paraded before the masses, forced to repent before their sentences were read. But every detail served a darker function. The locations were strategic main squares where merchants gathered, ensuring rumors would spread with the next trade caravan. The timing was deliberate, often scheduled near royal birthdays or military victories, binding the monarchy's authority to divine judgment. Even the Sanbenitos themselves were propaganda. After executions, these shameful garments were hung in local churches for decades, a permanent reminder that dissent had consequences. Consider the auto da fe at Valladolid in 1559. Over 40,000 people gathered to watch nobles, scholars, and even children as young as 14 sentenced for heresy. The event lasted 12 hours, blending sermon, trial, and execution into one relentless performance. When the first flames rose, witnesses reported the stench of burning flesh carried for miles, a sensory branding no pamphlet could match. But the real genius lay in the choreography. Prisoners who recanted were strangled before burning, a mercy meant to show the Inquisition's benevolence. Those who refused, their deaths were drawn out, their screams amplified by the square's acoustics. The psychological impact was calculated. Unlike private executions elsewhere in Europe, Spain's auto da fe required whole cities to participate. Families were forced to attend under threat of suspicion. Children brought to witness the horrors would grow into adults who policed their own thoughts. Local officials competed to host the events, knowing a lavish auto da fe could win royal favor. In Seville, the city council built special scaffolds with viewing platforms for elites, turning terror into theater for the privileged. Yet the greatest trick was how the Inquisition framed these spectacles as acts of communal purification. Crowds weren't just spectators, they were made complicit. After sentences were read, attendees had to swear oaths denouncing heresy, transforming fear into collective guilt. In Barcelona, citizens were ordered to bring firewood for the pyres, a twisted ritual where the public literally fueled the violence. The auto da fe's legacy wasn't just in its ashes, but in the silence that followed. When every marketplace could become a stage for horror, dissent didn't just vanish, it never dared speak at all. Behind the horror of public executions and secret torture chambers, the Spanish Inquisition wielded an even more insidious weapon: paperwork, mountains of it. Every arrest, every confession, every confiscated piece of property was meticulously documented in leather-bound ledgers with the precision of a modern tax audit. These weren't just records, they were a carefully constructed illusion of fairness, designed to make systematic terror look like divine justice. Take the case of Rodrigo de Mercado, a silk merchant from Granada. When he stood trial in 1523, the tribunal's scribes recorded every detail: the exact weight of the silver candlesticks seized from his home, the names of witnesses who'd allegedly seen him mutter Hebrew prayers, even the number of strokes he endured during interrogation. The documents were pristine, signed, notarized, and stamped with official seals, yet the evidence against him amounted to 2 anonymous notes slipped under the inquisitor's door. No accusers ever faced him, no proof was demanded. The illusion of due process masked a system where rumor held the force of law. This bureaucratic machine ran on 2 parallel tracks. On one side, there were volumes of procedural rules dictating how trials should be conducted. Interrogations couldn't last more than 4 hours at a stretch. Defendants had the right to legal counsel, though most lawyers were too terrified to mount real defenses, and confessions had to be freely given, a technicality often satisfied by waiting a few days after torture to ask again. But on the other side lay the reality: secret denunciations. The Inquisition actively encouraged citizens to report suspicions anonymously, even rewarding informants with a share of confiscated property. In Seville alone, archives reveal over 12,000 denunciations in a single decade, most unsigned, many clearly settling personal vendettas, the darkest irony. These very records, meant to legitimize the Inquisition, now expose its hypocrisy. In Toledo's archives, one ledger lists a man convicted for keeping Jewish fast days based on his neighbor's testimony. 3 pages later, the same neighbor is himself arrested for bribing officials to seize the man's vineyard. Another file from Valencia shows a priest denounced for heresy after he criticized the local inquisitor's lavish lifestyle. The verdict: guilty. The sentence: all his books burned, including a treatise on corruption in the church. What made this system so effective wasn't just its brutality, but its veneer of legality. A peasant watching an auto da fe might see divine justice at work, but a nobleman reading the tribunal's carefully crafted sentences would recognize something else: a warning that no one, no matter how wealthy or well-connected, was beyond the reach of a bureaucracy that could turn whispers into warrants with a stroke of a pen. The real terror wasn't just the flames, it was the ink. In the shadows of Spain's grand cathedrals, another kind of hunt was underway, one that had less to do with faith and everything to do with fear. While the Inquisition's tribunals targeted Jews, Muslims, and political rivals, they reserved a special kind of scrutiny for women who stepped outside the rigid boundaries of piety and obedience. Midwives, healers, and unmarried women, especially those with property or influence, found themselves disproportionately accused of heresy, witchcraft, or worse. This wasn't random. It was a systemic campaign to reinforce gender hierarchies under the guise of religious purity. Take the case of Isabel de la Cruz, a midwife in 16th century Avila. Known for her skill in delivering babies and treating ailments with local herbs, she was widely respected until the day a priest reported her for uttering strange prayers during a difficult birth. The real trigger: she'd refused to hand over her late husband's land to the church, claiming it was meant for her daughter. Within weeks, she was arrested, accused of concocting potions to induce miscarriages. Under torture, she confessed to consorting with demons, a confession that conveniently stripped her family of their inheritance. The pattern was disturbingly common. In Valencia, records show that nearly 70% of those tried for witchcraft were women, many of them healers or widows. The charges often followed the same script. A woman with knowledge of medicine or property without male oversight became a target. The Inquisition's manuals even included specific questions for female suspects, asking if they'd touched their bodies while preparing remedies, a deliberate blurring of healing and heresy designed to humiliate and condemn. But why this obsession with controlling women? The answer lies in the social earthquake shaking Europe at the time. The Protestant Reformation had sparked debates about women's roles, and Spain's Catholic elite saw independent women as threats to the natural order. Unmarried women, in particular, were viewed with suspicion, their autonomy defying the Church's ideal of female submission. When Catalina de Jesus, a wealthy spinster in Toledo, donated her fortune to educate poor girls, she was swiftly accused of corrupting young minds with unholy ideas. Her school was shuttered and her wealth redirected to a monastery. The Inquisition's treatment of women wasn't just about punishment, it was about spectacle. Trials of female heretics were often more lurid, with interrogators fixating on their sexuality. In one notorious case from Granada, a nun named Maria de la Visitación was accused of faking her stigmata after she criticized a bishop's lavish spending. Her trial transcripts dwelled obsessively on whether she'd seduced fellow sisters, reducing her spiritual defiance to scandalous gossip. Behind the smoke of burning pyres, a darker truth smoldered. The Inquisition didn't just target heresy. It enforced a social order where women who knew too much, owned too much, or dared too much were reminders of a world the authorities couldn't fully control. And in that world, independence wasn't just a crime, it was a heresy unto itself. By the mid-16th century, the Spanish Inquisition had perfected its machinery of control, and when galleons began crossing the Atlantic, that machinery came too. The year 1571 marked a turning point, the establishment of the Lima Tribunal, the first permanent Inquisition court in the Americas. But this wasn't just about exporting religious purity. It was about enforcing a brutal colonial order where faith served as the velvet glove over the iron fist of conquest. The Lima Tribunal's targets were telling. While indigenous people were theoretically exempt from its jurisdiction, supposedly new converts too ignorant to be heretics, the Inquisition found ways to tighten the screws. Instead of direct trials, they focused on mestizos, Africans, and anyone of mixed heritage who might corrupt indigenous communities with forbidden beliefs. Take the case of Francisco de la Cruz, a Dominican friar in Lima who preached that indigenous religions held kernels of divine truth. His trial wasn't just about theology, it was a warning to missionaries who might prioritize compassion over conquest. After years of torture, his confession implicated dozens of others, from scribes who copied his sermons to indigenous healers who'd shared their knowledge with him. The message: colonialism demanded ideological uniformity as much as military dominance. Yet the Inquisition's most insidious role lay in wealth extraction. Just as in Spain, tribunals in Mexico City and Cartagena became engines of confiscation. When the wealthy merchant Gonzalo Méndez was accused of secretly practicing Judaism in 1596, his silver mines were seized and handed to a crown-appointed overseer. The same pattern repeated with cocoa plantations, pearl fisheries, and even indigenous tribute payments redirected through inquisitorial coffers. Behind the burnings and bans, a grim calculus emerged. The Lima Tribunal's records show that over half its cases involved blasphemy, a conveniently broad charge often levied at indigenous leaders who resisted forced labor in Potosi's silver mines. One Quechua elder, accused of idolatry for preserving sacred huacas, saw his community's land redistributed to a Spanish encomendero after his execution. The Inquisition's colonial legacy wasn't just measured in autos da fe. It was etched into the very architecture of power, a system where fear kept silver flowing, where dissent could be branded heresy, and where the cross sanctified the crown's endless appetite for control. Not all the Inquisition's victims were people, some were ideas. As the Renaissance spread across Europe, bringing with it humanist philosophy, scientific inquiry, and bold new ways of thinking, Spain's inquisitors saw a different kind of heresy brewing, the freedom to question. And so, they built a fortress of censorship, systematically targeting books that challenged dogma or encouraged intellectual independence. At the heart of this campaign was the infamous Index of Forbidden Books, a growing list of banned texts that effectively strangled Spain's engagement with the Renaissance. Consider the fate of Erasmus of Rotterdam, the Dutch scholar whose writings on reform and reason electrified Europe. His works were devoured from Paris to Prague, but in Spain they were burned. The Inquisition denounced his praise of folly as poison for pious minds, not because it attacked faith, but because it mocked blind obedience to authority. Even his translation of the New Testament, which emphasized original Greek texts over church-approved Latin versions, was outlawed for daring to suggest scholars, not just priests, could interpret Scripture. By 1559, every single one of Erasmus' books was listed on the index, and printers caught with his texts faced fines, imprisonment, or worse. But Erasmus was just the beginning. The index grew into an encyclopedia of forbidden knowledge, banning everything from Arabic medical treatises, which challenged Galen's outdated theories, to novels like La Celestina for its immoral portrayal of love. Even books with marginal notes questioning church doctrine were confiscated. In Seville, a merchant's library was raided because a single volume contained handwritten musings on astronomy, a field the Inquisition distrusted for contradicting biblical cosmology. The suppression wasn't just about religion, it was about power. When the humanist Juan de Valdez argued that faith should be personal rather than policed, his circle of intellectuals, the Alumbrados, were hunted down. Their crime, suggesting that spiritual truth could exist outside the Inquisition's control. Similarly, when scientific works by Copernicus began circulating, they were swiftly banned not for inaccuracy, but for undermining the idea that earthly and heavenly order mirrored each other, a metaphor the monarchy relied on to justify absolutism. The cultural toll was devastating. Universities withered as curricula narrowed to approved texts. Spanish thinkers who might have contributed to the scientific revolution fled or fell silent. And the public, terrified of owning dangerous books, often burned their own libraries preemptively. In Valencia, a scholar's widow was recorded weeping as she fed her husband's life's work into the fireplace, lest a single forbidden page condemn her. Yet the greatest irony lay in the Inquisition's own archives. Meticulously cataloging every banned idea, they preserved the very thoughts they sought to erase, leaving future generations to rediscover what Spain had been forced to forget. The Inquisition's dungeons were laboratories of pain where suffering was calibrated with chilling precision. Among the most feared tools was the strappado, a deceptively simple device that turned gravity into an instrument of agony. Victims' hands were bound behind their backs, then hoisted by a rope until their shoulders dislocated. Some were dropped suddenly, the jerk snapping tendons like overstretched strings. But the real genius of the strappado lay in its adaptability. Inquisitors could intensify the torment by adding weights to the ankles or prolong it by leaving prisoners suspended for hours, their screams muffled by thick stone walls. Water torture, known as toca, was equally methodical. Prisoners were strapped to inclined boards, their heads lower than their feet, while cloth was stuffed into their throats. Then water was slowly poured over the fabric, simulating drowning without leaving visible wounds. The body's reflexive gasping only drew the wet cloth deeper, triggering primal panic. Survivors described the sensation as drinking death itself. Unlike crude medieval tortures, these techniques were designed to maximize psychological terror while minimizing physical marks, crucial for extracting unblemished confessions to present at public trials. Contrary to popular myth, the Inquisition rarely burned its victims alive. Executions were more often carried out by garroting or hanging before the corpses were consigned to flames, a distinction coldly noted in tribunal ledgers as relegado al brazo secular, released to the secular arm. The auto da fe's fiery spectacles were theatre, but the real brutality happened behind closed doors. In Seville's secret prisons, a man named Luis de Leon endured 7 years of intermittent torture before confessing to blasphemy, only to have his voluntary repentance read aloud at his sentencing as proof of the Inquisition's mercy. Confessions followed a grim script. After days or weeks of isolation and sleep deprivation, prisoners were shown the instruments awaiting them if they remained obstinate. Many broke at this stage, signing pre-written admissions. Those who held out faced sessions carefully timed to avoid permanent damage. A week between tortures to allow recovery, making the next round even more unbearable. In Valencia, a scribe recorded an inquisitor advising colleagues to stop before the ribs crack during water torture, not out of compassion, but to preserve the victim's voice for a convincing courtroom performance. The ultimate goal was never truth, it was spectacle. A confession, even one later retracted, provided the moral cover for public punishment. When the merchant Diego Lopez protested that his admission of Judaizing had been coerced, the tribunal simply noted his original statement as evidence and burned him anyway. Their ledgers dutifully recorded his screams as the devil's final protest. In this way, the Inquisition turned torture into liturgy, where every cry of pain became a verse in the hymn of absolute control. Even after baptism, the Morisco's Muslims forcibly converted to Christianity remained under relentless suspicion. Their faith was never trusted to be genuine, and the Spanish Inquisition deployed an elaborate network of spies to infiltrate their communities, watching for any hint of crypto-Islam. These informants lurked in marketplaces, eavesdropped in bathhouses, and even posed as fellow converts, all to catch families engaging in forbidden rituals like washing before prayer or refusing pork. One notorious case unfolded in Granada, where a weaver named Ahmed ibn Yusuf, now baptized as Diego Lopez, thought he had hidden his past well. He attended Mass, crossed himself in public, even named his son after a Christian saint. But his downfall came from something as simple as a neighbor noticing his wife drying linen on Fridays, the traditional Muslim day of communal prayer. The accusation led to a raid where inquisitors found a hidden copy of the Quran sewn into a mattress. Under torture, Diego admitted to leading secret prayers in his cellar. His real crime, refusing to sell his prime vineyard to a local bishop's nephew. The surveillance extended beyond random denunciations. The Inquisition recruited double agents from within Morisco communities, often targeting those desperate for protection. In Valencia, a man named Hernando El Zec turned informant after his own brother was accused of heresy. For years, he attended weddings and births, reporting which families still used Arabic names or washed their dead according to Islamic rites. His betrayal sent 19 households to the stake, but when his usefulness ended, the tribunal arrested him too, convicting him on fabricated evidence. The lesson was clear, even collaborators weren't safe. Some of the most chilling records involved children. In Toledo, 2 boys no older than 12 were paid to spy on their parents, noting if their mother still turned eastward when cooking or if their father avoided wine. One child's testimony alone condemned his entire family, their property divided between the crown and the priest who had coached him. The Moriscos lived in a world where every habit, a preference for cumin over pork fat, a hesitation before eating sausage, could be dissected for heresy. By 1570, the paranoia reached such heights that Valencia's tribunal banned the sale of eggplant, accusing Moriscos of using the vegetable to secretly make Muslim dishes. The Inquisition wasn't just eradicating Islam, it was erasing an entire way of life, one whispered report at a time. The cobblestone streets of Antwerp ran red in 1566, but this time the blood wasn't spilled in the name of faith alone, it was the spark that would ignite a war. When Spanish troops marched into the Netherlands under orders to crush Protestant heretics, they didn't just bring soldiers, they brought the Inquisition. Public burnings of reformers became weekly spectacles in Brussels. Merchants watched as their Lutheran neighbors were dragged from their homes for owning banned Bibles. And with each execution, resentment against Spanish rule grew hotter than the pyres themselves. What began as a religious crackdown would spiral into the 80 Years' War, a conflict that didn't just weaken Spain's grip on Europe, but exposed the fatal flaw in its empire of fear. Take the case of Hendrik van Brederode, a nobleman who'd initially sworn loyalty to King Philip II. When Inquisition tribunals began confiscating his Protestant friends' estates, he famously tore up his oath, declaring, "I cannot serve a master who makes martyrs of honest men." His rebellion wasn't isolated. Dutch cities that had once paid taxes to Madrid now funneled gold to rebel armies, their battle cries echoing the Inquisition's victims. Liever Turks dan Pops, rather Turkish than Papist. The irony was brutal. Spain's obsession with religious purity had turned its wealthiest province into a breeding ground for defiance. The tactics backfired spectacularly. In Harlem, after Spanish troops executed 20 Protestant leaders in 1573, the city's defenses, previously divided, united overnight. Women reportedly hurled rocks and boiling oil at besiegers, buying time for rebel reinforcements. Meanwhile, pamphlets circulated across Europe, detailing Inquisition tortures with woodcut illustrations so graphic they turned global opinion against Spain. Even Catholic France, no friend to Protestants, began quietly funding Dutch rebels, seeing a chance to cripple their Habsburg rivals. By the 1580s, the financial toll was staggering. Maintaining an army to suppress the Netherlands cost Spain over 2 million ducats annually, draining silver shipped from the Americas. Worse, Dutch privateers, emboldened by hatred of Spain, began intercepting those very treasure fleets. In one audacious raid in 1628, Admiral Piet Hein captured the entire Spanish silver fleet, funding the rebellion for years. The Inquisition's fires had lit a fuse that blew a hole in Spain's economy. The greatest miscalculation, though, was ideological. Spain framed its war as a holy crusade, but the Netherlands rebranded resistance as a fight for freedom. When Antwerp fell in 1585, its Protestant printers didn't flee, they relocated to Amsterdam, flooding Europe with subversive texts. One engraving showed the Spanish lion gnawing its own leg off, a metaphor for how the Inquisition's hunger for control was devouring Spain's own strength. By the time the Peace of Westphalia ended the war in 1648, Spain wasn't just defeated, it was diminished. The Dutch Republic, born from Inquisition brutality, had become a global power, while Spain's treasury and reputation lay in ruins. The lesson was clear: you could terrorize a people into obedience, but only until they realized fear was all you had left. While the Spanish Inquisition hunted down whispers of Protestantism with ruthless efficiency, just beyond Spain's borders, a starkly different reality played out. In cities like Amsterdam and London, Protestant merchants printed Bibles in plain sight, while in Seville, the mere possession of such texts could mean a death sentence. This double standard wasn't accidental, it was a deliberate strategy to isolate Spain from the tidal wave of reformation sweeping Europe. Take the case of William Harborne, an English merchant arrested in Seville in 1568. His crime, a single copy of a Calvinist prayer book found hidden in his trunk. The tribunal didn't just target Harborne, they used his trial to send a message. His Spanish business partners were hauled in for questioning, their homes ransacked for contamination. One was forced to publicly renounce all foreign contacts, his warehouses confiscated as penance. Meanwhile, in Antwerp, Spanish bankers still financed trade with Protestant England, their ledgers conveniently ignoring the heresy of their business partners. The hypocrisy ran deeper than commerce. In France, despite periodic Catholic-Protestant violence, the crown eventually granted Huguenots limited rights under the Edict of Nantes in 1598. But in Spanish-controlled Milan, a Lutheran cobbler named Hans Vischer was burned alive in 1572 for refusing to kiss a crucifix, a spectacle attended by local dignitaries as a lesson. The disparity revealed Spain's deepest fear, ideological infection. Where other nations saw Protestantism as a rival sect, Spain's monarchy treated it as a contagion that could unravel their entire imperial theology. Nowhere was this more evident than in the handling of foreign communities. Dutch Protestant traders in Cadiz lived under constant surveillance, forced to attend Mass while spies noted who crossed themselves insincerely. Yet those same merchants' counterparts in Rotterdam hosted Catholic masses in private homes without interference. The Inquisition's obsession with purity created a paradox. Spain's economy relied on Protestant-held silver from the Americas and Flemish wool, even as its tribunals punished those who facilitated that trade. The case of the Seville 12 laid bare the system's brutality. In 1581, a group of English merchants was accused of holding secret Bible readings. Under torture, one confessed to a non-existent Protestant conspiracy involving smuggled books. The auto da fe that followed featured a macabre twist. The men were garroted before burning, a mercy granted only after they signed papers donating their assets to the church. Their executioners then hosted a banquet for local officials, serving wine from the condemned merchants' confiscated cellars. This selective persecution had unintended consequences. As Protestant powers grew richer from global trade, Spain's economy stagnated under the weight of its own intolerance. The very merchants the Inquisition drove out became the architects of rival empires, funding Dutch independence, English exploration, and the eventual eclipse of Spanish power. The tribunal's fires, meant to purify, had instead reduced Spain to a fortress of fear, one whose walls grew thinner with every heretic burned. When the Alhambra decree expelled Spain's Jews in 1492, the kingdom didn't just lose a religious minority, it lost its doctors, its financiers, its most skilled artisans. Overnight, cities like Toledo and Cordoba saw their silk workshops fall silent, their tax revenues plummet, and their hospitals scramble to replace physicians who'd fled to Istanbul or Amsterdam. The economic shockwave was immediate. In Valencia, the price of wool, a trade dominated by Jewish merchants, tripled within a year. In Seville, the crown's own ledgers showed a 40% drop in customs duties as trade networks unraveled. Yet rather than admit their catastrophic miscalculation, Ferdinand and Isabella doubled down, blaming the crisis not on the expulsion itself, but on the shadowy Judaizantes they claimed had stayed behind. The scapegoating was grotesquely efficient. When silver mines in Guadalcanal failed to meet production quotas, inquisitors discovered that the overseers were secretly Jewish, their heresy supposedly cursing the enterprise. Never mind that the real issue was the loss of Jewish engineers who'd managed the complex drainage systems. In Zaragoza, a banking collapse triggered by the exile of Jewish moneylenders was reframed as divine punishment for hidden synagogues operating in cellars. The tribunal even produced confessions from tortured prisoners alleging a vast conspiracy to sabotage Spain's economy, a fiction that justified raiding the homes of Converso merchants who'd taken over the trades. Some of the most tragic cases involved medical knowledge. Jewish doctors fleeing Spain carried centuries of accumulated expertise to Ottoman and Italian courts, where sultans and popes eagerly employed them. Meanwhile, Spanish cities grappled with outbreaks of plague and dysentery, their remaining physicians often less experienced. In 1503, when Queen Isabella fell gravely ill, her own court scrambled to recruit a Jewish doctor from Portugal, the same man whose family had been exiled a decade earlier. He refused, a devastating symbol of the talent Spain had squandered. The crown's response escalated the Inquisition. By 1520, tribunals were specifically targeting professions once dominated by Jews, pharmacists accused of poisoning Christians, tax collectors charged with embezzlement to fund Judaism, even scribes whose handwriting supposedly revealed Hebrew influences. In Mercia, a renowned watchmaker was arrested because his precision gears, a craft learned from Jewish mentors, were declared too perfect to be Christian work. His tools were confiscated, and the city's clock tower froze for years afterward. The cruelest irony, many conversos who genuinely embraced Christianity now faced suspicion precisely because they filled the gaps left by the expulsion. A silk dyer in Granada, baptized as a child, became his city's leading textile merchant, only to be accused of Judaizing when competitors resented his success. His trial featured lurid claims that his red dyes contained blood of Christian children, a charge that conveniently erased his decades of donations to local churches. By the mid-16th century, Spain's downward spiral was undeniable. The same tribunals that had seized Converso wealth now lamented the laziness of Spaniards who couldn't maintain the workshops they'd stolen. In Lisbon and Naples, exiled Jewish families built thriving printing houses that circulated books banned in Spain, including translations of the very Arabic scientific texts Christian scholars now struggled to access. The Inquisition's solution: burn more heretics, seize more property, and dig ever deeper for the conspiracy they'd invented to explain away their own ruin. The real heresy, it seemed, was admitting the truth. That purity came at too high a price. Pope Sixtus IV never intended the Spanish Inquisition to become what it did. When he issued the papal bull authorizing its creation in 1478, he envisioned a controlled instrument for combating heresy, not the unchecked terror it rapidly became. Within just 2 years, his own letters reveal growing horror at reports from Spain. Entire towns were being terrorized, trials lacked basic fairness. Confessions were extracted through methods so brutal that even veteran church officials blanched. In 1482, Sixtus took the extraordinary step of suspending the Inquisition's operations, demanding reforms to protect the innocent. King Ferdinand's response: a masterclass in political defiance. He didn't openly reject the Pope's authority. That would risk excommunication. Instead, he launched a whispering campaign, spreading rumors that Sixtus was soft on heresy and secretly sympathetic to Converso influence in Rome. Meanwhile, inquisitors continued burning heretics under the pretense that the papal order hadn't officially reached them. By the time Sixtus's envoys arrived in Spain with the suspension decree, entire archives of trial records had mysteriously burned, making review impossible. The clash reached its peak over the case of Pedro de Arbres, an inquisitor murdered in Zaragoza Cathedral in 1485. The Pope saw it as proof the Inquisition had gone too far, sparking violent backlash. Ferdinand spun it as martyrdom, pressuring Sixtus to canonize Arbres while secretly accelerating executions of the accused killers, most of them wealthy conversos whose land would soon fill royal coffers. When Sixtus again demanded oversight, Ferdinand played his trump card. He threatened to withhold Spanish troops from the Pope's wars in Italy. Within months, the suspension was quietly lifted. But this wasn't the last papal challenge. In 1516, Pope Leo X tried to reform the Inquisition by limiting torture and guaranteeing defense counsel. King Charles V simply issued a royal decree overriding it, declaring Spain's unique doctrinal dangers required harsher measures. When Leo protested, Charles's ambassadors hinted at reviving the medieval tradition of antipopes, a not-so-subtle threat to split the church if Rome interfered. The most striking confrontation came in 1558, when Pope Paul IV, a fierce reformer, ordered Inquisition trials to be conducted in Latin so defendants could understand the charges. Spain's inquisitors ignored him, continuing proceedings in obscure legal jargon. When the Pope summoned the Inquisitor General to Rome for reprimand, Philip II simply forbade the man from leaving Madrid. The standoff lasted years until Paul's death allowed Spain to install a more compliant pope. These battles reveal the Inquisition's true nature. It wasn't a religious institution answering to Rome, it was a state security force disguised as one. Each time a pope tried to rein it in, Spanish monarchs weaponized nationalism, painting interference as foreign meddling in Spain's sacred fight against heresy. By the late 1600s, the Vatican's own archives referred to the Spanish Inquisition as that royal lawless court, a rare moment of candor about who really held the leash. Not every town bowed to the Inquisition's terror. In the shadows of Spain's grand cathedrals, ordinary people risked everything to protect their neighbors, sometimes with knives as sharp as their defiance. Take the mountain village of Teruel, where locals once smuggled an accused heretic out of his own trial through a secret tunnel beneath the courthouse. When inquisitors arrived to arrest a cobbler named Miguel, they found his workshop empty, his tools still warm. The entire village swore under oath they'd seen nothing, even as fresh footprints in the snow led straight to a nearby convent. Years later, records showed the nuns had hidden Miguel for months, disguising him as a mute gardener until he could flee to Navarre. But the most brazen act of resistance erupted in Zaragoza in 1485, when the city's fury boiled over onto the steps of its own cathedral. Pedro de Arboles, the iron-fisted inquisitor who turned Aragon into a hunting ground, was kneeling in prayer when assassins struck. Witnesses later described shadowy figures emerging from the choir stalls. Some say local nobles, others whispered they were merchants whose families Arboles had ruined. Their blades found the gaps in his chainmail hood, stabbing him so fiercely the altar ran red. The assassination sent shockwaves through Spain. Here was proof that the Inquisition's grip could slip, that even its most feared enforcers weren't untouchable. The fallout exposed the rot beneath the Inquisition's facade of unity. Arboles' murder wasn't some lone act of vengeance, it was the climax of years of quiet rebellion. In the weeks before his death, Zaragoza's guilds had secretly funded lawyers to challenge his tribunals. Farmers along the Ebro River refused to sell food to inquisitors, forcing them to import supplies at triple the cost. Even the city's bishop, normally a loyalist, had privately begged Rome to rein Arboles in, calling his methods a scandal to Christendom. Crackdowns followed, of course. Dozens were arrested, their confessions extracted with the very tortures Arboles had pioneered. Yet the resistance left scars that never fully healed. Inquisitors who once traveled with tiny retinues now demanded armed escorts. Trials in Aragon slowed to a crawl as witnesses grew suddenly forgetful. And in Zaragoza's back alleys, graffiti appeared overnight, a single word scrawled where Arboles had fallen: Justicia. The message was clear. However many bodies the Inquisition burned, fear alone couldn't erase the truth. Some flames only made the shadows grow taller. The obsession with purity didn't just fuel persecution, it warped reality itself. In the fevered imagination of the Inquisition, everyday habits became damning evidence. A family enjoying eggplant stew might as well have signed their own death warrant. The dish was deemed too Moorish. A merchant refusing a slice of ham at a business dinner. Obvious proof of secret Judaism. Even the way someone folded their laundry could spark accusations, as one Toledo woman discovered when a neighbor reported her for suspiciously pressing shirts on Fridays. The line between piety and paranoia had vanished, replaced by a looking-glass world where the most mundane acts hid sinister meaning. Consider the case of Dr. Alonso de Cordoba, a physician whose patients praised his skill until the day he prescribed a meatless diet for a nobleman's gout. The cure worked, but the ingredients, lentils, chickpeas, and fish, matched Sephardic fasting traditions. Within weeks, Alonso was in chains, his medical texts scrutinized for Kabbalistic codes. The irony, His treatment came straight from Galen's ancient Greek writings, a cornerstone of Christian medicine. Truth no longer mattered. What counted was the narrative. Any deviation from rigid norms confirmed heresy. This mania birthed something even darker: Europe's first experiments with racial pseudoscience. Scholars like Cardinal Juan Martínez Silicio began arguing that Jewish ancestry wasn't just a spiritual taint, it was biological, surfacing generations later in un-Christian traits. His infamous 1547 treatise claimed Converso descendants had weaker blood that made them prone to greed and deception. Soon, tribunals were demanding genealogical records stretching back centuries, interrogating elderly relatives about long-dead ancestors. In Cuenca, a man was convicted because his great-grandmother's neighbor swore she'd once seen the woman walk like a Jew, whatever that meant. The most grotesque distortions came in the courtroom. In Valencia, a butcher testified that accused crypto-Jews had a certain smell, while a Seville tribunal consulted experts who claimed Jewish converts' wounds bled differently. One trial featured a midwife asserting that Converso women gave birth in a distinctive posture. None of this was science, it was superstition dressed in academic robes designed to justify the unjustifiable. Yet the crowning absurdity came in 1595 when the Inquisition arrested a deaf farmer for heresy by omission. Unable to hear Mass, he'd failed to recite the creed properly. His defense: he'd been deaf since birth. The tribunal ruled his disability irrelevant, his soul was still at risk. The farmer escaped burning only after his landlord, desperate to keep a good worker, bribed officials to commute the sentence. In this climate, no one was safe from the madness. A Burgos weaver spent 5 years in prison because his blue dye allegedly matched Jewish ritual colors. A child's nursery rhyme about lambs was denounced for containing hidden Hebrew. Even the dead weren't spared. Skeletons were exhumed to measure skull shapes for heretical traits. The Inquisition hadn't just lost its way, it had reinvented reality, where fear turned lentils into evidence and every shadow hid a conspiracy. The true heresy, it seemed, was being human in an inhuman system. By the 17th century, Spain's economy was gasping for air, choked by the very institution meant to strengthen it. While Dutch merchants crisscrossed the globe in sleek flight ships, amassing fortunes from spice trades and banking innovations, Spain's once mighty ports languished. The difference wasn't just policy, it was paranoia. The Inquisition's relentless targeting of merchants, financiers, and skilled artisans didn't just remove individuals, it gutted entire sectors of the economy, leaving Spain dependent on New World silver while its rivals built sustainable wealth. Take the silk industry. In medieval Toledo, Jewish and Converso weavers had dominated the trade, producing fabrics so exquisite they were demanded by courts from Paris to Constantinople. But after the expulsions and heresy trials, the looms fell silent. Attempts to replace the exiled craftsmen failed spectacularly. Spanish guilds, restricted by purity statutes, barred anyone with suspected Jewish ancestry from apprenticeship, even as Venetian and Ottoman silk workshops eagerly snapped up the exiled masters. By 1600, Toledo's production had dropped by 80%, and the crown was importing silk from Italy at triple the cost. The Inquisition's ledgers celebrated each confiscated workshop as a victory for purity, but the royal treasury paid the price. Meanwhile, in Amsterdam, the opposite was unfolding. Dutch authorities didn't just tolerate Jewish and Protestant refugees from Spain, they actively recruited them. When the merchant Diego Teixeira fled Lisbon to escape the Inquisition, he brought with him networks that stretched from Brazil to the Baltic. Within a decade, his family was financing Dutch East India Company voyages, their expertise in diamond cutting and sugar refining fueling new industries. Spain's loss became Holland's windfall, a pattern repeated with Huguenot glassmakers, Flemish textile dyers, and Sephardic bankers. The Dutch didn't just welcome these heretics, they built an economic system that rewarded innovation over orthodoxy. The contrast was starkest in finance. Spanish inquisitors viewed banking as inherently suspect, accusing Converso financiers of usury while conveniently seizing their ledgers. In 1620, when the crown defaulted on its debts again, it blamed Jewish greed, ignoring the fact that its own policies had driven away the very moneylenders who once kept its wars afloat. Meanwhile, Amsterdam's stock exchange, founded in part by Sephardic Jews, became the engine of Europe's first modern economy. Spanish nobles sneered at speculation, even as Dutch traders turned commodities like tulip bulbs into liquid assets, funding infrastructure Spain could only dream of. Perhaps the cruelest irony lay in agriculture. The Moriscos expelled in 1609 weren't just farmers, they were heirs to centuries of Islamic irrigation science. After their departure, Valencia's legendary huertas, once lush with oranges and rice, withered under inexperienced hands. Dutch hydrologists studying Spanish texts salvaged from Inquisition bonfires adapted those very techniques to drain their own swamps, creating fertile polders where Spain saw only heresy. By the time Madrid realized its mistake, it was importing Valencian oranges grown from smuggled cuttings in Dutch greenhouses. The Inquisition's true cost wasn't just measured in autos da fe, but in the slow bleed of talent and opportunity. While Spain burned books, the Dutch printed them. While Spanish officials interrogated astronomers for unorthodox stargazing, Leiden University hired them. Every innovator lost, every trade route abandoned, every industry stifled in the name of purity left Spain poorer, not just in gold, but in the ideas that would define the modern world. The tribunal's fires didn't just consume lives, they lit the fuse of Spain's decline, one whispered accusation at a time. Maria González never saw the accusation coming. A respected widow in her small Castilian village, she'd spent years carefully managing the olive grove her husband left her, until the morning Inquisition guards dragged her from her home. The charge, her neighbor, a bitter rival named Alonso de Quesada, had sworn under oath that he'd seen her lighting candles on Friday nights, a telltale sign of crypto-Judaism. Never mind that Maria was a devout Christian who volunteered at the local church. The tribunal didn't need proof, just Alonso's testimony and the whispered suspicions of others eager to settle scores. This wasn't justice, it was a system rigged for betrayal. The Inquisition's courts operated in suffocating secrecy, where accusers remained anonymous and defendants were forbidden to know their exact charges. Witnesses could testify without facing cross-examination, and the penalty for false accusations was laughably light, a few Hail Marys at most. Meanwhile, the consequences of being accused were catastrophic. Maria's grove, the envy of the village, was confiscated pending investigation. Its harvest sold to a merchant who happened to be Alonso's cousin. By the time she was cleared, months later, after enduring isolation and sleep deprivation, her trees had been neglected, their value destroyed. The real scandal lay in how common this was. In the archives of Cuenca, one ledger records a woman denounced by her own sister-in-law over a disputed inheritance. In Seville, a wealthy merchant was accused of heresy by a business rival who then purchased his confiscated warehouse at a fraction of its worth. Even children weren't spared. A 12-year-old in Toledo was pressured to testify against his parents after inquisitors promised him a share of their seized property. But Maria's case held a twist that laid bare the system's rot. Years later, Alonso's own son was arrested for blasphemy after drunkenly bragging about how his father had invented the candle story to steal land. The tribunal's response: they buried the son's confession, fearing it would undermine confidence in their methods. Maria, by then destitute, received no restitution. The lesson was clear. The Inquisition's courts weren't designed to find truth, they were factories for manufacturing guilt, where every accusation, no matter how absurd, kept the machinery of fear well-oiled and humming. In the suffocating shadow of the Inquisition, survival demanded more than courage, it required cunning. Secret Judaism thrived in the unlikeliest places. A butcher's shop in Seville where pork was sold publicly but lamb was slaughtered in hidden back rooms. A convent in Toledo where nuns whispered Hebrew psalms while embroidering altar cloths. Families developed elaborate ruses to preserve their faith. A merchant might host lavish Sunday feasts for neighbors complete with ham prominently displayed while his real Sabbath meal was eaten quietly the night before in a cellar lit by candles concealed inside hollowed-out loaves of bread. Some of the most ingenious adaptations were woven into daily objects. Take the so-called Inquisition chairs, ordinary-looking seats with false bottoms where Torah scrolls or prayer books could be hidden. Carpenters built these with such precision that even a thorough search might miss their secrets. One confiscated chair in Cuenca contained a compartment accessible only by pressing a disguised knot in the wood, revealing a miniature prayer shawl and a tiny silver goblet for ritual wine. Other artifacts were even more covert. Rings with swiveling bezels that concealed miniature Hebrew inscriptions, or rosary beads strung in patterns that secretly counted the days to Passover. Language itself became a weapon of resistance. In Valencia, Morisco families communicated through coded nursery rhymes, their lyrics praising Christian saints while subtly referencing Islamic teachings. A lullaby about the Virgin Mary might contain a hidden plea to Allah, its true meaning known only to those raised in the tradition. Converso merchants developed hand signals, adjusting a hat or tapping a coin to identify allies without speaking. Even recipes held double meanings. A dish called a la podrida, a stew of pork and chickpeas, became a test. Those who avoided the pork were marked as suspects, but others tweaked the recipe with eggplant or lamb, signaling their true beliefs to the initiated. The most heartbreaking adaptations were those involving children. Parents drilled their sons and daughters in elaborate lies, teaching them to cross themselves theatrically or loudly blame stomachaches for avoiding pork. In one documented case, a mother sewed tiny crosses into her daughter's undergarments, knowing inquisitors wouldn't strip search a child, but the stakes were unimaginably high. In Granada, a boy of 9 betrayed his parents after a priest rewarded him with sweets for reporting their suspicious Friday baths. Yet for every tragedy, there were stories of defiant creativity. In Barcelona, a Jewish convert turned the Inquisition's obsession with purity against them, commissioning a portrait of himself kneeling before a crucifix painted on a wooden panel that slid aside to reveal a menorah. He displayed it prominently in his home, knowing no official would dare dismantle such a pious image. Survival wasn't just about hiding, it was about outthinking an empire of fear, one whispered prayer, one cleverly disguised artifact at a time. The echoes of the Spanish Inquisition didn't fade with the last auto da fe. They reverberated through history, resurfacing in regimes that understood the power of fear as a political tool. Centuries later, Francisco Franco's dictatorship in Spain would dust off the Inquisition's playbook, wrapping authoritarianism in the same cloak of religious and national purity. When Franco rose to power after the Spanish Civil War in 1939, he didn't just invoke Catholicism as a unifying force, he weaponized it, reviving the language of heresy to silence dissent. Loyalty to the state became synonymous with orthodoxy, and deviation was branded as a moral contagion, an eerie parallel to the Inquisition's obsession with limpieza de sangre. Franco's secret police, the Brigada Politico-Social, operated with methods chillingly reminiscent of inquisitorial tribunals. Anonymous denunciations flooded their offices, just as they had in 16th-century Seville. Neighbors accused neighbors of red sympathies or moral degeneracy, knowing a single rumor could trigger midnight arrests. Prisoners were held incommunicado, their trials conducted in secrecy, their confessions extracted under duress. Even the rhetoric was recycled. Franco's regime framed its violence as a crusade against ideological impurity, mirroring the Inquisition's claim that terror was necessary to save souls. But the similarities didn't end with Spain. Half a world away, the Stasi in East Germany built one of the most comprehensive surveillance states in history, turning citizens into informants just as the Inquisition had done. The Stasi's obsession with monitoring private lives, recording conversations, planting spies in workplaces, even collecting scent samples from suspects' chairs wasn't just about crushing dissent. It was about creating a climate where fear choked the very possibility of independent thought, much like the Inquisition's networks of eyes and ears in every village. Even the rhetoric of ideological purification found new life in 20th century regimes. The Khmer Rouge's brutal elimination of intellectuals and bourgeois elements in Cambodia echoed the Inquisition's targeting of educated conversos and reformers. Both systems shared a paranoid logic, the belief that erasing contamination required erasing people. And just as the Inquisition's campaigns against heresy masked land grabs and political consolidation, so too did modern purges often conceal economic exploitation, whether Stalin's confiscation of kulak farms or the Nazi seizure of Jewish property. The most unsettling parallel lies in the way these regimes borrowed the Inquisition's genius for spectacle. Franco's public executions, the Soviet show trials, even the McCarthy-era hearings in America, all staged rituals of humiliation designed to break not just the accused but the will of those watching. Like the auto da fe, these performances transformed oppression into theater, making complicity a civic duty. Yet history offers a grim consolation. Systems built on fear and surveillance often contain the seeds of their own collapse. Just as the Inquisition's excesses eventually eroded Spain's power, modern authoritarian regimes have discovered that terror, while potent, is ultimately brittle. The Stasi's vast archives couldn't prevent the fall of the Berlin Wall. Franco's Spain, for all its repression, couldn't stamp out the cultural revival that blossomed after his death. The lesson is as old as the Inquisition itself. You can force obedience, but you can't command belief, and sooner or later, the whispered truths outweigh the shouted lies. For centuries, the Vatican maintained an eerie silence about the Inquisition's horrors, but in March 2000, that silence finally broke. In a historic ceremony at St. Peter's Basilica, Pope John Paul II knelt before a cross and begged forgiveness for the sins committed in the service of truth by the Church. It was a shocking moment, broadcast worldwide, the first official acknowledgement that the Inquisition's tortures, burnings, and shattered lives could never be justified as God's work. Yet even this apology carried layers of awkward evasion. The Pope's carefully worded speech avoided mentioning Spain by name, focusing instead on errors by unnamed sons and daughters of the Church. For descendants of the Inquisition's victims, the gesture felt hollow. They apologized for the method, not the crime, remarked a Sephardic rabbi in Jerusalem whose ancestors had fled Toledo in 1492. Spain itself has wrestled with this legacy in fits and starts. Unlike Germany's stark Holocaust memorials or South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Spain's reckoning has been hesitant, tangled in politics and national pride. In Toledo, the medieval synagogue of Santa Maria la Blanca, seized by the Inquisition and converted into a church, now bears a small plaque acknowledging its Jewish past. But just steps away, the Museum of the Inquisition, housed in a former tribunal building, has drawn criticism for its sensationalized displays of torture devices. Some historians arguing it treats the violence as morbid entertainment rather than historical trauma. The tension between memory and forgetting plays out in quiet ways. In Seville's Barrio Santa Cruz, a labyrinth of whitewashed alleys once home to a thriving Jewish quarter, tourists sip sangria in courtyards where families were dragged from their homes. Few plaques mark these spots, just an occasional Star of David subtly embedded in the cobblestones by recent activists. Meanwhile, in cities like Avila and Cordoba, descendants of Conversos have begun petitioning for the return of ancestral properties seized by the Inquisition, their legal battles exposing how much of Spain's wealth still rests on foundations of confiscation and blood. The most poignant memorials exist outside Spain altogether. In Istanbul's Zulfaris Synagogue, a museum documents the exodus of Sephardic Jews welcomed by the Ottoman Empire, a stark contrast to the expulsion edict signed by Ferdinand and Isabella. And in New Mexico, descendants of Conversos who fled to the Americas still light Friday candles in secret 5 centuries later, their rituals a living rebuke to the Inquisition's failed erasure. What's missing, scholars argue, is an official Spanish apology akin to Portugal's 2015 law granting citizenship to Sephardic descendants. When Spain's parliament debated a similar measure, far-right politicians protested, calling it an attack on Spanish identity. The irony is painful. The same nation that once defined itself by purging impurity now resists confronting the voids it created. The ghosts of the Inquisition linger not in the grand gestures, but in the stubborn silence of empty synagogues, the unmarked graves, the family recipes for eggplant stew that still skip the pork, a history written not in ink but in absence. The Spanish Inquisition's legacy isn't just a tale of religious fanaticism, it's a blueprint for how power operates in shadows. Behind the smoke of burning pyres lay 3 ruthless agendas: wealth extraction, political domination, and the erasure of entire cultures. The tribunals didn't just punish heresy, they engineered a system where faith became the mask for greed, where fear was the currency of control, and where diversity was crushed beneath the boot of uniformity. Consider the staggering sums siphoned from accused families' estates stripped, businesses seized, and chests of gold funneled directly into royal coffers. In Valencia alone, the Inquisition's ledgers show over 2 million ducats confiscated in a single decade, funding everything from royal weddings to foreign wars. This wasn't justice, it was state-sponsored robbery disguised as divine mandate. Political control flourished in the silence the Inquisition created. By branding dissent as heresy, the crown turned neighbors into informants and regional leaders into trembling supplicants. The trial of the Count of Urgell wasn't about theology, it was about dismantling Catalonia's autonomy. The auto da fe wasn't just execution theatre, it was a calculated performance to remind every noble, merchant, and scholar that defiance meant ruin. Even the church wasn't immune. When bishops like Carrillo dared question the tribunals, they found themselves in the dock, their authority shredded by inquisitors loyal only to the throne. But perhaps the Inquisition's most enduring crime was its war on memory. From banning Arabic medical texts to forcing Morisco children to betray their parents' traditions, it sought to amputate Spain from its own multicultural roots. The result, a nation stripped of its thinkers, its artisans, and the very diversity that once made it a beacon of medieval progress. The irony burns as brightly as the pyres did. In purging so-called impurity, Spain impoverished itself, while the exiled Jews, Muslims, and reformers it expelled became architects of rival empires. So here's the unsettling question that lingers like smoke. How much of this playbook still operates today? When governments surveil citizens under the guise of security, when corporations monetize personal data while preaching convenience, when media stokes panic to fuel partisan agendas, are we watching new inquisitions unfold? The methods have evolved, but the calculus remains eerily familiar. Identify a threat, amplify the fear, and profit from the control it brings. The Spanish Inquisition teaches us that systems built on fear don't just vanish, they adapt. And the real heresy, then as now, is daring to ask who benefits.